Close your eyes if you like, and let your breathing slow, just a little, just enough to feel the gentle weight of the evening settling around you. The way a woolen blanket might settle across tired shoulders on a cold and quiet night. Somewhere in another century, somewhere far from here, somewhere you are only visiting in the softest way, as a traveler who carries no luggage, who needs nothing, who simply drifts. Let your body grow heavy now, heavy and still, sinking gently into whatever surface holds you, and know that you are safe here, entirely safe, while the voice you are listening to carries you backward through time, not with urgency, not with the sharp edges of drama, but with the slow and careful movement of a river finding its way to the sea. We are going to a place that existed long ago, a place of stone corridors and high windows, and the distant sound of church bells marking the hours in a world that understood very little about the complicated landscape of the human mind. We are going to the Victorian Asylum. And if this voice helps you rest tonight, if it carries you gently down into the dark, warm waters of sleep, then perhaps, when morning comes and you are still, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake, only if the thought drifts to you softly, the way all good thoughts do, just before sleep. The Victorian era spans, broadly speaking, the reign of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, who ascended to the throne on the 20th of June in the year 1837, and ruled until her death on the 22nd of January in the year 1901, a period of 63 years that encompassed the most rapid transformation of industrial society the world had yet witnessed. And within that transformation, there grew, slowly and unevenly, a system of institutions dedicated to the care, or what was understood to be the care, of those whose minds were believed to have strayed from the path of reason. It is worth noting, before we travel any further, that the question of what constituted madness in the 19th century was deeply entangled with questions of social order, economic utility, gender expectation, and religious morality, and that the asylum as an institution was not born, fully formed, but rather evolved across the decades, shifting its purposes and its practices in ways that reveal as much about Victorian society as they do about Victorian medicine. The story we are tracing tonight begins not in a laboratory and not with a discovery, but in the much older and quieter history of how human communities have always responded to those among them who seemed, in the language of the time, to have lost their senses. That history is long, and it is worth allowing it to unfold slowly, the way the night unfolds, the way sleep itself unfolds, one layer releasing beneath another, each layer softer and more yielding than the last. Before there were Victorian asylums, before there were county institutions and lunacy commissions, and carefully drafted acts of parliament, there was Bethlem. And Bethlem is where any honest account of English psychiatric history must begin, for Bethlem is the institution whose name became a word, whose story contains within it the whole long arc of what it meant to confine the mind in the service of order, and whose corridors echo through everything that came after. The hospital, known formally as the Bethlem Royal Hospital, was founded in the year 1247 as a priory of the Order of St. Mary of Bethlehem, situated in Bishopsgate, just outside the walls of the City of London, established not as a place of mental care, but as a religious house, a priory of monks who moved through its rooms in contemplative silence, their days governed by the rhythm of prayer and scripture. It was only gradually, over the course of the following century and a half, that the priory began to receive those it called lunatics, and by the year 1403, the records of the institution show that mentally ill patients had come to form the majority of those it housed, making it, by any reasonable measure, the first institution in England devoted to the long-term confinement of the mentally ill. The word Bethlem, worn down by centuries of casual speech, became Bedlam, and Bedlam became a common noun, a word meaning chaos and disorder and wild noise, a word that carried within it the accumulated memory of all those who had passed through its gates, all those whose suffering had become, in time, part of the architecture of the English language itself. It is worth pausing here, in the soft and unhurried way that this kind of history invites, to consider what the institution at Bethlem actually looked like in the centuries before the Victorian era. Because the conditions it housed and the attitudes it expressed cast a long shadow over everything that the reformers of the 19th century would later work so hard to change. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, Bethlem operated as an institution in which the fundamental premise of care was one of control, the belief being that the mad were not capable of rational experience, not capable of suffering in the way that ordinary people suffered, and that what they required was management rather than medicine, restraint rather than remedy. The patients of Bethlem in this period were frequently confined in chains, were housed in conditions that later observers would describe as deeply inadequate, were provided with little warmth and less privacy, and were in some periods of the institution's history exhibited to paying visitors, members of the public who could pay a small admission fee, a penny or two, to walk through the galleries and observe the confined patients, as one might observe animals in a menagerie. The Quaker philanthropist Edward Wakefield visited Bethlem in the year 1814 and recorded in his notes what he witnessed there, describing naked and starved men who were chained to the walls, and describing in particular one individual who had been held in mechanical restraint for a period of more than a decade, a man named James Norris, who had been fitted with an iron harness that connected him by chains to the wall of his cell, a construction so elaborate and so constraining that it had become, over the years, a kind of second skeleton around him. The account of Norris was presented to a parliamentary committee in 1815 and provoked a response of measured but genuine alarm from those legislators who had not previously been required to consider what happened behind the locked doors of England's oldest psychiatric institution. Meanwhile, in the broader landscape of English society, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the numbers of those being identified as mad and requiring institutional care were growing slowly at first, and then with increasing speed as industrialization drew populations from the rural countryside into the crowded and chaotic environments of the industrial city, where the pressures of poverty, overwork, physical illness, and social dislocation created conditions in which the fragility of the human mind became more visible, more publicly apparent, and more urgently in need of some kind of systematic response. The private madhouses that had operated throughout the 18th century, small establishments run for profit by their proprietors, had long attracted criticism from those who suspected that they were used as much for the convenient disposal of inconvenient people as for the genuine treatment of illness, and the scandals that periodically emerged from behind their walls, stories of sane individuals confined on the instructions of wealthy relatives, stories of patients brutalized by their keepers, stories of the most basic dignities of human life, withheld without explanation or apology. These stories accumulated through the decades, until they formed a weight that Parliament could no longer ignore. It is worth noting here, in passing, that the question of who could be confined and on what authority was, in this period, an extremely loose and poorly regulated matter, requiring in practice little more than the agreement of a family member and a medical certificate provided by a physician who had perhaps spent no more than a few minutes with the individual in question. And that this looseness of procedure created conditions in which the asylum could become, and frequently did become, a mechanism for social control rather than a mechanism for care. The County Asylums Act of 1808 represented Parliament's first significant attempt to address the provision of public institutional care for the insane, requiring that counties make provision for pauper lunatics, those without financial resources of their own, though the Act offered only weak encouragement rather than firm compulsion, and its uptake across the counties of England was accordingly uneven, slow, and incomplete over the following decades. During this same period, at the very beginning of the 19th century, a different kind of thinking about the nature of madness was beginning to emerge, one that would have profound consequences for the shape of the Victorian asylum and for the experiences of those who would come to live within it. This way of thinking went by the name of moral treatment, a phrase that requires some explanation, for the word moral in this context does not carry precisely the sense it carries today, but it refers rather to something closer to the French word morale, meaning the emotional and psychological life of the patient, the inner world of feeling and perception that the new thinkers believed to be at the center of mental illness, and therefore at the center of its remedy. The origins of moral treatment are typically traced to two institutions and two men whose work, conducted independently in France and in England, arrived at remarkably similar conclusions in the same decades of the late 18th century. In France, Philippe Pinel, a physician who had been appointed to the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in 1793, undertook what became one of the most celebrated acts in the history of psychiatry, ordering the removal of the iron chains from the patients confined there, an act that carried powerful symbolic weight, even if its practical effects were more complicated and more partial than the legend that grew up around, it would later suggest. And in England, in the city of York, a Quaker tea merchant named William Tuke, disturbed by reports of the death of a fellow Quaker in the York Asylum, under circumstances that seemed to suggest negligence and cruelty, established in 1796 a small institution he called the York Retreat, which would become the most influential model of humane psychiatric care in the English-speaking world. The York Retreat, sitting quietly on the outskirts of the city of York, surrounded by gardens that William Tuke believed to be as important to the recovery of its patients as any medical treatment, was designed on principles that marked it as something genuinely different from everything that had preceded it in the history of English psychiatric care. The patients of the retreat were not confined in chains, were not subjected to the bleeding and purging and other physical interventions that constituted mainstream medical treatment of the period, were instead housed in a setting that attempted to replicate, as far as possible, the conditions of a well-ordered and affectionate family home, with regular meals, outdoor walks, organized activities, and the constant company of attendants who were expected to behave with patience and with kindness. William Tuke's grandson Samuel Tuke published in 1813 a description of the retreat under the title Description of the Retreat, an institution near York for insane persons of the Society of Friends, and this document, circulated widely among physicians, philanthropists, and legislators, became one of the foundational texts of the asylum reform movement a quiet and careful account of what it was possible to achieve when the fundamental humanity of the patient was taken seriously rather than discarded. At the gate, it is worth noting, even as we admire the intentions of the retreat, that its model was one of gentle but consistent discipline, a framework in which the patient was expected to internalize the norms of rational, temperate, industrious behavior, and that critics have since argued that this internalized discipline, however kindly imposed, was in its own way a form of control, a reshaping of the self in accordance with the values of the institution, rather than a genuine liberation of the individual from suffering. And yet, the retreat represented, in the first decades of the 19th century, something that the older institutions had never offered, which was the possibility that the mad could be treated as human beings. That madness was not a permanent condition, but one from which recovery was possible, and that the environment in which a person lived had a direct and measurable effect on the health of their mind. The idea that environment mattered, that the physical and social conditions of life had consequences for mental health, was not merely a theoretical proposition in the early 19th century, but was increasingly supported by the observations of those physicians who were beginning to call themselves alienists, the men who dedicated their careers to the study and treatment of mental illness, and who were building, slowly and with considerable effort, the foundations of what would eventually become the medical specialty of psychiatry. Among the most significant of these figures in the English contexts was John Connolly, a physician whose career would become closely associated with the principle of non-restraint, the belief that the use of mechanical restraints on patients was not only unnecessary, but actively harmful to their recovery, and who, as medical superintendent of the Hanwell Asylum in West London, abolished the use of all mechanical restraints in that institution in the year 1839, demonstrating to a skeptical medical establishment that a large public asylum housing several hundred patients could be managed without chains, without straitjackets, without the physical coercion that so many of his contemporaries believed to be an indispensable tool of institutional management. Hanwell, which had opened in 1831 as one of the new generation of county asylums built in the years following the 1808 Act, became under Connolly's leadership something of a showpiece of the reform movement, visited by physicians and administrators from across England and from other countries, its wards described by those who inspected them as orderly and humane, its patients engaged in the kinds of domestic and agricultural work that moral treatment held to be both therapeutically beneficial and practically necessary to the running of the institution. The principle of workers' therapy, the belief that regular and purposeful labor was not a form of exploitation, but a form of treatment, a means of restoring the habits of the rational mind, was central to the moral treatment philosophy, and would remain a feature of the Victorian asylum system for the rest of the century, though its character and its conditions would shift considerably as the decades passed, and as the asylums themselves changed in ways that their early architects had not anticipated. The year 1845 represents perhaps the most significant legislative moment in the entire history of Victorian psychiatric care, a moment when the various currents of reform, advocacy, and institutional expansion that had been building across the preceding decades were gathered together and given formal expression in two pieces of legislation that would fundamentally reshape the landscape of madness in England and Wales for the remainder of the century and beyond. The Lunacy Act of 1845 and the County Asylums Act of 1845 were passed through Parliament simultaneously, their provisions so closely interwoven that they functioned effectively as a single legislative instrument, and they were championed above all by Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, a man whose long career in public life was distinguished by a consistent and genuine concern for the welfare of those whom Victorian society most readily forgot, from the child labourers of the coal mines to the patients of the pauper asylums. The Lunacy Act created the Lunacy Commission, a body of 11 metropolitan commissioners drawn from legal, medical, and lay backgrounds, charged with overseeing the conditions of all lunatics in England and Wales, whether confined in public asylums, in private madhouses, or in workhouses, and with making regular reports to Parliament on what they found. The County Asylums Act, for its part, compelled every county in England and Wales, for the first time, as a matter of legal obligation, rather than mere encouragement, to provide adequate institutional accommodation for its pauper lunatics, a provision that would set in motion over the following decades a vast program of asylum construction that would transform the physical landscape of the English countryside and the institutional landscape of English medicine simultaneously. Shaftesbury himself served as head of the Lunacy Commission from its founding in 1845 until his death in the year 1885, a span of 4 decades during which he oversaw the transformation of the English asylum from a scattered and largely unregulated collection of institutions into something approaching a national system, however imperfect and however contradicted by its own practices that system might sometimes have been. The commission that Shaftesbury led set about its work with the quiet, methodical energy of a Victorian administrative body committed to its purpose, dispatching its inspectors to travel across the country and report on the conditions of every asylum they visited, producing annual reports that accumulated year by year into a comprehensive, if deeply sobering, portrait of the state of English psychiatric care at the middle of the 19th century. What the commissioners found in asylum after asylum, in county after county, was a picture of enormous variation, of institutions that ranged from the genuinely humane to the genuinely disturbing, of wards that were clean and well-ordered, and of wards that were overcrowded and underheated, of attendants who treated their patients with patience, and of attendants who treated them with contempt, of superintendents who embraced the principles of moral treatment, and of superintendents who regarded those principles as idealistic nonsense, unsuited to the practical demands of managing large numbers of difficult and sometimes dangerous individuals. It is worth holding in the mind, as we contemplate these reports, the sheer scale of what was happening in the middle decades of the Victorian era, the scale of an expansion that few had predicted, and that none had fully planned for, as the number of individuals being identified as lunatics and certified for confinement grew from year to year, with a consistency that alarmed those who had hoped the new system of care would demonstrate its effectiveness through declining numbers, through the recovery of patients and their return to society, rather than through the steady and almost inexorable accumulation of long-term residents who entered the asylum and never left. In the year 1844, on the eve of the landmark legislation, there were approximately 21,000 certified lunatics in England and Wales, confined in the various institutions that then existed. By the year 1890, that number had risen to somewhere in the region of 86,000, a 4-fold increase over 4.5 decades. An increase that reflected not simply a rising prevalence of mental illness in the population, but a complex interplay of factors, including the expansion of the diagnostic categories available to certifying physicians, the social and economic pressures of industrial life that made the asylum an attractive solution for families struggling with a difficult member, and the institutional logic of an expanding system that had every incentive to admit patients and limited means of discharging them. The great Victorian asylum buildings that rose across the landscape of England in the decades following the 1845 legislation were, in their physical form, expressions of a particular set of ideas about the relationship between architecture, environment, and the health of the mind. The architects and administrators who designed them, drawing on the principles articulated by the pioneers of moral treatment, believed that the right kind of building in the right kind of setting could itself be a therapeutic instrument, that the calm regularity of well-proportioned corridors, the green expanse of gardens and airing grounds, the separation of patients by sex and by the nature of their condition, the provision of a chapel and a hall for entertainments and workshops for the practice of useful trades. All of these elements were not merely conveniences, but components of a carefully designed therapeutic environment, whose effect on the minds of those who inhabited it would be, if everything worked as intended, one of gradual restoration, of a slow return from the chaos of illness to the orderly habits of rationality and self-governance. Colney Hatch Asylum in North London, which opened in 1851, and which was at the time of its opening the largest asylum in England, housing over 1,000 patients within a building whose Italianate facade stretched for more than a third of a mile along the edge of what was then still a rural landscape of fields and hedgerows, was designed with all of these principles in mind, its corridors airy and its gardens extensive, and its workshops equipped for a variety of trades, its chapel large enough to accommodate the full patient population for services on Sunday mornings. And yet, within a decade of its opening, Colney Hatch was already overcrowded, already struggling with numbers its designers had not anticipated, already beginning the slow slide toward the institutional deterioration that would characterize so many of the great Victorian asylums as the century wore on. The social world of the Victorian asylum was, for those who lived within it, an entirely enclosed and largely self-sufficient universe, a world in which the rhythms of daily life were governed entirely by the institution rather than by the individual, in which the hours of waking and sleeping, of eating and working, of exercise and rest were determined by the rules and routines of the asylum rather than by any desire or preference of the patient. This enclosure was not, in the minds of those who designed the system, a punishment or an indignity, but a feature, an essential component of the therapeutic environment, for it was precisely the disruption of regular habits and rational routines that was believed to lie at the heart of mental illness, and it was therefore the restoration of those habits and those routines, through the careful and consistent enforcement of an ordered daily schedule that was believed to constitute the core of treatment. The patients of the Victorian Asylum woke at a fixed hour, dressed themselves according to the institutional rules about clothing and appearance, ate their meals at fixed times in the dining halls of the institution, and then dispersed to their various appointed tasks, the women to the laundry and the sewing rooms and the kitchens, the men to the workshops and the gardens and the farms that most of the larger asylums maintained as both an economic necessity and a therapeutic instrument. In the evenings, there were sometimes entertainments, musical performances, or theatrical productions staged by the patients themselves, under the direction of the staff, an institution called the Asylum Concert, or the Asylum Ball, that took place with remarkable regularity in many of the larger Victorian institutions. And that represented, in its own way, a genuine attempt to provide the patients with something that resembled the ordinary social pleasures of life outside the walls. Meanwhile, the medical understanding of mental illness that informed the daily practice of the Victorian Asylum was itself in a state of considerable confusion and flux throughout the middle decades of the 19th century, a confusion that reflected not any particular failing of the physicians involved, but the genuine difficulty of the problem they were attempting to address. The problem of understanding a class of conditions that affected the most complex and least accessible organ in the body, that presented in an enormous variety of forms, and that resisted with notable stubbornness every attempt to explain them in terms of the mechanical and chemical processes that were proving so productive in other areas of Victorian medicine. The alienists of the mid-Victorian period were committed, as a professional matter of some importance, to the proposition that mental illness was a disease of the brain, a physical disorder of a physical organ, and not, as earlier generations had sometimes believed, a moral failing or a spiritual disorder or the consequence of some supernatural intervention. This commitment to a somatic, body-based understanding of madness was in many ways a progressive and humanizing move, for it implied that the patient was suffering from something that had happened to them rather than something that they had brought upon themselves, and it created the theoretical foundation for the idea that medical treatment might be able to help. And yet, the science required to fulfill this commitment, the detailed understanding of brain anatomy and physiology that might have allowed the alienists to identify specific pathological processes underlying specific forms of mental illness, was simply not yet available in the middle decades of the 19th century, leaving the physicians of the asylum in the difficult position of being committed to a biological model of illness that they had no means of substantiating, of knowing that something was wrong with the brain without being able to say with any precision what that something was. The treatments available to the Victorian asylum physician were consequently a mixture of the empirical and the hopeful, of practical measures that seemed to produce some observable benefit in some patients, and of theoretical interventions derived from medical principles that were themselves incompletely understood, applied with a degree of confidence that the actual evidence perhaps did not fully warrant. Hydrotherapy, the use of water in its various temperatures and forms as a therapeutic instrument, was among the most widely employed treatments in the Victorian asylum, applied in ways that ranged from the soothing, warm prolonged baths in which agitated patients might be immersed for hours at a time, in the hope that the warmth and stillness of the water would calm the nervous system and reduce the symptoms of excitement, to the cold shower baths and duches that were applied to unresponsive or deeply melancholic patients in the hope that the shock of cold water would rouse the nervous system from its torpor and restore some degree of responsiveness and engagement. Alongside hydrotherapy, the Victorian asylum employed a pharmacological arsenal that included, most notably, the various preparations of chloral hydrate and bromide salts that came into widespread use. In the second half of the 19th century, chemical sedatives that were effective at reducing agitation and inducing sleep, but that were, over time, recognized to carry significant risks of dependence and of the physical deterioration that accompanied long-term heavy sedation. It is worth noting that the use of chemical sedation while it solved certain immediate practical problems of asylum management, was in some tension with the principles of moral treatment, which had emphasized the importance of engaging the rational faculties of the patient rather than suppressing them, and that the increasing reliance on sedatives in the later Victorian period was recognized by some thoughtful observers at the time as a symptom of the institutional difficulties that were increasingly undermining the therapeutic ambitions of the asylum system. The question of who was admitted to the Victorian asylum, of who came to be identified as a lunatic and confined behind the walls of these institutions, is one of the most revealing questions that the historian of Victorian psychiatry can ask, because the answers to it illuminate with particular clarity the ways in which the asylum system was shaped by the social and cultural assumptions of the world that created it, and in particular by the assumptions about gender, about class, and about the nature of acceptable behaviour that pervaded Victorian society in all its dimensions. The procedures governing admission to a Victorian public asylum required, under the legislation of 1845 and its successors, that the individual to be confined be certified as a lunatic by two medical practitioners who had separately examined them, and that this certification be accompanied by a statement from a justice of the peace or other appropriate authority, authorizing the removal of the individual to the asylum, a procedure that was in theory designed to protect the individual from wrongful confinement, but that in practice created a system in which the boundary between the sane and the insane was drawn not by any consistent or objective standard, but by the judgment of physicians who carried within them all the social assumptions of their age. The admission records of Victorian asylums, many of which survive in county archives and have been studied by historians of psychiatry, list among the stated reasons for admission conditions and circumstances that speak eloquently of the values of the society that produced them, including alongside what we would today recognize as symptoms of genuine mental illness, a range of social and behavioral failures that tell a rather different story. Among women admitted to Victorian asylums, the diagnosis of hysteria was both the most common and the most socially freighted, a category so broad and so imprecisely defined that it was capable of encompassing almost any behavior that deviated from the Victorian ideal of the quiet, compliant, domestically oriented woman, and one that was applied with a frequency and a consistency that reflected not the clinical precision of its practitioners, but the social anxieties of a culture that found in the language of medicine a convenient means of managing behaviours it found troubling or threatening. A physician writing in 1859 claimed that more than a quarter of all women suffered from hysteria, a figure that speaks less to any epidemiological reality than to the extraordinary elasticity of the diagnosis itself, to the readiness with which the label was applied to women whose nervousness or emotionality or simple assertiveness exceeded what the social norms of the period permitted. Women were admitted to Victorian asylums for reasons that included not only recognized symptoms of mental illness, but conditions as varied as the menopause, difficult childbirth, grief at the loss of a husband or child, religious devotion judged to be excessive, the expression of sexual desire outside the boundaries of marriage, and in some documented cases, the act of seeking a divorce from an abusive husband, a step so far outside the range of expected female behavior that it could be read by the certifying physician as evidence of a disordered mind. The consequences of such admissions, whatever the circumstances that had produced them, were often permanent For the Victorian Asylum had limited means of discharging patients, and even less institutional incentive to do so, and many women who entered these institutions in the middle decades of the century remained within them, growing older within walls they had not chosen, until they died. The experience of the male patient in the Victorian Asylum was shaped by its own set of social assumptions. Assumptions that centered above all on the question of economic productivity and rational self-governance, on the capacity to hold employment and manage one's affairs, and fulfill the obligations of citizenship and family life that Victorian masculinity demanded. Men were admitted to the asylum for reasons that included violence and aggression, conditions that threatened the immediate safety of those around them, but also for conditions far less obviously dangerous, for the deep and sustained melancholia that prevented a man from working, and thus from fulfilling his role as provider, for the consequences of alcoholism, which was widely recognized in the period as a cause of mental deterioration, even if the moral language that surrounded it complicated the application of a medical framework to its treatment, and for the various forms of cognitive decline that accompanied the later stages of neurosyphilis, a disease whose underlying cause would not be identified until the 20th century, but whose effects on the mind, the progressive deterioration of memory and judgment and personality, that the Victorian physicians called general paralysis of the insane, made it one of the most common diagnoses in the male wards of the Victorian Asylum by the middle of the century. It is worth noting here, with the gentle observation, that so much of Victorian medical practice invites that the men who staffed the Victorian Asylum, the medical superintendents and assistant medical officers, and the attendants who provided the daily hands-on care of the patients, were themselves products of the same social world that had created the diagnostic categories they applied, and that their judgments about who was mad and who was merely difficult, who was ill and who was simply poor, who required treatment and who required only containment, were judgments made within the limits of a social and medical imagination, that the passing of time would reveal to be partial and in many cases deeply unjust. By the 1860s and 1870s, the optimism that had accompanied the great legislative reforms of 1845 and the institutional expansion that followed them had begun to cool, replaced by a mood that historians of Victorian psychiatry have called psychiatric pessimism, a pervasive and increasingly articulate sense that the asylum system had not delivered on its therapeutic promises, that the great institutions whose construction had been undertaken with such hope and at such expense had become, in practice, enormous warehouses for the chronic and the incurable, rather than hospitals in any meaningful therapeutic sense of the word. The numbers told their own story with a patience that no one who examined them could easily argue away. In asylum after asylum across England, the proportion of patients who were discharged recovered was declining year by year, while the proportion who remained for years, and then for decades, within the institution was rising, and the physical conditions of the institutions themselves, stretched beyond the populations they had been designed to accommodate, were deteriorating in ways that the Lunacy Commission's inspectors noted. With increasing frequency, and with a note of resignation that crept into even their most formally composed official reports. Colney Hatch, which had opened in 1851, designed for a population of somewhat over 1,000 patients, housed more than 2,000 by the early 1870s, its corridors busier than their designers had intended, its kitchens and laundries and workshops straining to absorb a labour force that had outgrown the facilities provided for it, its gardens and airing grounds crowded with a population that had nowhere else to go. The causes of this failure, as it came to be perceived, were complex and disputed, and the debate about them occupied much of the intellectual energy of the medical and administrative world of the later Victorian asylum. One school of thought associated with the growing influence of hereditarian ideas about the transmission of mental illness through family lines held that the asylum population was expanding because the hereditary taint of madness was spreading through the population, that the children of the insane were themselves more likely to become insane, and that no amount of therapeutic intervention could alter what was ultimately a biological destiny inscribed in the blood and the nerves of those who carried it. This hereditarian pessimism, drawing on a vulgarized understanding of the evolutionary ideas that Charles Darwin had published in 1859 in his Origin of Species, fed into what became known as the theory of degeneration, the belief that certain families and certain social groups were in a process of biological decline, their nervous systems weakened by generations of poverty, of alcoholism, of disease, of the accumulated stresses of industrial life, and that the asylum was merely the place where this decline became most visible, the repository of those in whom the process had gone furthest. It is worth noting that these ideas, however influential they became in the later decades of the 19th century, were never unchallenged, that there were always alienists and physicians who continued to believe in the possibility of recovery, who continued to insist that the conditions of the asylum itself were part of the problem rather than simply the setting in which an inevitable deterioration was playing itself out, and whose voices, though sometimes lost in the larger chorus of institutional pessimism, would, in the longer view, prove to have been closer to the truth. The physical fabric of the large Victorian asylum, as it existed in the final decades of the century, was a world unto itself, a world with its own geography and its own customs and its own quiet rhythms, a world in which the original therapeutic ambitions of the asylum's founders had become overlaid with the practical accommodations and institutional compromises of decades of operation. The great buildings, with their long corridors and their high-ceilinged wards and their chapels and their kitchens and their gardens, had settled into a routine that was not precisely what moral treatment had intended, but that had its own kind of order, its own kind of stability, a stability that was for some of the long-term residents, something close to comfort in its familiarity, if not in any deeper sense. The attendants who provided the daily care of the patients were, for the most part, working-class men and women who had come to the asylum not out of any particular vocation for psychiatric care, but because the asylum offered regular employment, a wage, accommodation on the grounds or nearby, and a degree of security that was not easy to find in the labour markets of Victorian England. And their relationship with their patients was shaped by the enormous power differential that the institutional setting created, the attendant holding over the patient, a degree of authority that was nearly absolute in the daily practical sense, the power to determine when a patient ate and slept and bathed and worked, the power to apply or withhold the small privileges and small comforts that made institutional life more or less bearable. And yet within this power differential, within this structure of confinement and control that the Victorian asylum embodied in its every physical and administrative detail, there existed also something else. Something that the official records and the formal inspectors' reports only partially capture, and that required the letters of patients themselves, when those letters survived, to make fully visible. There existed, in the Victorian asylum, human relationship, human attachment, the quiet persistence of individual personality in the face of an institutional system designed, however inadvertently, to smooth those individualities away. Patients wrote letters to their families, letters in which they described their days and expressed their longing for home, and asked about the children and the gardens and the neighbours they had left behind. Attendants, those whose characters were kind, formed genuine attachments to the patients in their care, attachments that expressed themselves in small acts of accommodation and consideration, in the extra blanket brought to a shivering patient, in the quiet conversation maintained with a patient who would otherwise have spoken to no one for days at a time. The archival records of Broadmoor, the institution established in 1863 in Berkshire for the confinement of criminal lunatics, those individuals who had committed offences while in a state of mental disorder, preserve letters from patients that reveal, to the historian who reads them with care, the texture of individual experience within the institution, the mix of resignation and hope and complaint and gratitude and longing that constitutes the inner life of a person confined against their will within walls they have not chosen, surviving within an institution that was never quite what its architects had intended, and was never quite as bleak as its most dramatic critics claimed. The decade of the 1870s arrived in England with a quality of grey institutional fatigue that had settled over the asylum system like the particular kind of fog that rolls in from the Thames on November mornings, slow and soft, and so gradual in its coming that one barely notices when it has arrived, and yet finds, upon reflection, that one can no longer see very far in any direction. The great buildings that had been raised with such civic pride in the middle years of the century, those long Italianate and Gothic facades that presented themselves to the surrounding countryside as monuments to Victorian benevolence and rational administration, were by this decade struggling under the weight of populations that had grown far beyond what their architects had imagined, and the therapeutic idealism that had guided their construction was being slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly replaced by something more pragmatic, more resigned, and considerably less hopeful. The superintendents who presided over these institutions were men of considerable professional ambition and genuine medical seriousness, trained in the disciplines of Victorian medicine, committed to the proposition that mental illness was a disease of the brain, and therefore in principle amenable to medical treatment, and yet confronted every day with the practical reality of wards that were overcrowded, staff that were undertrained and overworked, and patients whose conditions showed little sign of responding to anything that the medicine of the day had to offer. The Lunacy Commission's annual reports from this period make for reading that is quiet in its expression and deeply revealing in its implications, the careful bureaucratic prose of the commissioners recording, year after year, the same patterns of overcrowding and understaffing and insufficient provision, the same recommendations made, and the same failure to act upon them, with a patience that itself speaks to the particular quality of Victorian administrative life, to the way in which the machinery of public oversight could document a problem exhaustively while remaining largely unable to resolve it. It is worth pausing here, in the unhurried way this kind of history invites, to consider what the daily experience of overcrowding actually meant for the patients who lived within it, what it meant in the most physical and immediate sense to inhabit a ward designed for 80 patients that now housed 120 to sleep in beds arranged so close together that the warmth and the sounds of one's neighbours were a constant and inescapable presence through the long hours of the institutional night. The heating of the large Victorian asylum ward was provided, in most institutions, by a system of pipes carrying hot water or steam from a central boiler. A system adequate to the ward as designed, but increasingly inadequate to the ward as it actually existed, so that the patients in the beds furthest from the heat source spent the winter months in a chill that the quarterly inspections of the Lunacy Commission noted with concern, but could not, by the act of noting it, actually remedy. The diet of the Victorian pauper asylum patient was governed by a scale of provision that was calculated to maintain physical health at the minimum economical cost. And while it generally succeeded in preventing the frank malnutrition that had characterized the conditions of the earliest institutions, it was monotonous to a degree that the medical officers themselves acknowledged as a source of misery to those who endured it through years and decades of institutionalization. The work expected of patients, both as therapy and as economic contribution to the running of the institution, continued throughout this period. The women in the laundry and the sewing rooms and the kitchens and the men in the gardens and the workshops and the farm and the reports of the period occasionally note, with a quietness that does not fully conceal the unease behind it, that the line between workers' therapy and workers' simply labour had become, in the overcrowded asylum of the later Victorian period, increasingly difficult to identify with any confidence. And yet, the asylum of the 1870s and 1880s was not simply a place of suffering, was not simply an institution that had failed its patients and its ideals, and settled into a comfortable indifference to both, for within its walls there continued to exist, alongside the overcrowding and the monotony and the institutional resignation, genuine acts of care, genuine relationships of trust and affection between patients and the staff who knew them well, genuine moments of pleasure and connection in the concerts and the garden walks and the Christmas entertainments that punctuated the institutional calendar. The human capacity for accommodation and for finding, within constrained circumstances, the small territories of comfort and meaning is one of the most persistent and most moving features of the historical record of Victorian asylum life, and it is a capacity that the formal documents of the system, the inspection reports and the medical journals, and the administrative correspondence only partially reveal, leaving the rest to be recovered from the letters and the diaries and the occasional published memoir that have come down to us from those who passed through these institutions and lived to write about the experience. The medical theorizing that occupied the alienists of the later Victorian period was conducted in an atmosphere of increasing professional anxiety, an anxiety that arose from the gap between what the somatic theory of mental illness promised and what the actual practice of the asylum was able to deliver, and from the growing awareness that this gap was not simply a temporary condition waiting to be resolved by the next advance in brain science, but might reflect something deeper and more intractable about the nature of mental illness itself. The dominant figure in later Victorian psychiatric thinking was Henry Maudsley, whose prolific writings from the 1860s onward articulated, with unusual intellectual force and unusual pessimism, the hereditarian view of mental illness that was increasingly shaping the professional culture of the English asylum, the view that madness was in large part a consequence of hereditary taint, of the biological degradation of the nervous system across generations, and that the prospects for the recovery of the majority of asylum patients were accordingly limited. Maudsley's Body and Mind, published in 1870, and his subsequent The Pathology of Mind, which appeared in 1879, were works of formidable scholarly ambition that drew on the emerging science of neurophysiology and on the evolutionary framework of Darwin and Herbert Spencer to construct a comprehensive account of mental illness as a manifestation of nervous degeneration, a biological process rooted in the inheritance and in the physical constitution of the individual, rather than in the circumstances of their life or the conditions of the institution in which they were confined. It is worth noting that Maudsley's pessimism, however intellectually rigorous in its own terms, was not universally shared among his contemporaries, and that figures such as Daniel Hack Tuke, grandson of the York Retreats founder William Tuke, continued to argue for a more environmentally sensitive and more therapeutically optimistic understanding of mental illness, one that took seriously the possibility that the conditions of the asylum itself might be contributing to the chronicity that the pessimists attributed entirely to hereditary inevitability. The tension between these two perspectives, between the hereditarian pessimism that Maudsley represented and the more reforming and therapeutically hopeful tradition that the Tuke family embodied, runs through the intellectual history of Victorian psychiatry like a quiet fault line, always present beneath the surface of professional discourse, occasionally breaking through in the debates that appeared in the pages of the Journal of Mental Science, the professional publication of the asylum superintendents that had been established in 1853. The physical examination of patients, the inspection of the brain and nervous system, in life and at autopsy, was a matter of increasing importance to the Victorian asylum physician committed to the somatic theory of mental illness, and the post-mortem examination room was a standard feature of the larger Victorian institutions, a space in which the medical officers hoped to find, in the physical tissue of the brain, the pathological changes that would confirm their theoretical commitments and provide the biological foundation for a classification of mental diseases that would at last give the specialty the scientific credibility it sought. What they found, for the most part, was inconclusive. The brains of those who had suffered from the various conditions, classified as madness showing, with the exception of the clearly organic cases, such as general paralysis of the insane, no consistent or diagnostically useful patterns of abnormality. A result that was simultaneously frustrating and deeply instructive, pointing toward the possibility that the conditions they were studying might not resolve into the kind of neatly bounded disease entities that the medical science of the period was accustomed to working with. The classification of mental diseases was itself a matter of considerable professional disagreement in the later Victorian period, with different authorities proposing different systems of categorization, different ways of dividing the territory of madness into manageable and diagnostically coherent regions, systems that were often incompatible with one another, and that reflected the theoretical commitments of their authors as much as any agreed clinical reality. Wilhelm Griesinger in Germany, who argued in his influential 1845 textbook that mental diseases were brain diseases, and who became one of the most cited authorities in European psychiatry, proposed a unitary psychosis model in which the various forms of mental illness were stages in a single underlying process rather than distinct conditions, a model that competed in the Victorian asylum world with the more pluralistic classification schemes developed by figures such as Carl Ludwig Karlbaum, who described catatonia in 1874, and Ewald Hecker, whose account of hebephrenia in 1871 laid the groundwork for the diagnostic categories that Emil Kraepelin would later synthesize into the foundational classification of modern psychiatry. And in this world of competing theories and uncertain science, the patients of the Victorian Asylum continued to rise each morning at the institutional hour, to eat their meals at the institutional times, to work in the institutional workshops and gardens, and to lie down each night in their crowded wards, carrying within them the private experiences of their illnesses and their institutionalization. That no theory, however sophisticated, was yet equipped to fully reach or fully understand. The women's wards of the Victorian Asylum deserve particular attention because the experiences of female patients illuminate with unusual clarity the ways in which the institution was embedded within and shaped by the broader social structures of Victorian gender. And because the history of women in the Victorian Asylum is one that has been recovered only partially and with considerable effort from records that were generated almost entirely by men, and that therefore carry within them all the assumptions and all the limitations of a male professional gaze applied to female experience. The female patient entered the Victorian Asylum through a process of certification that had been navigated, in most cases, by men, by the husband or father or brother who had initiated the process, and by the male physicians who had made the certification, and by the male magistrate who had authorized the removal. And she entered an institution in which the senior medical staff were without exception male. The medical superintendent and his assistant medical officers occupying a position of absolute professional authority over a patient population that, in the women's wards, was predominantly female, but was managed through a hierarchy in which women occupied only the subordinate positions of matron and nurse and attendant. The domestic work to which female patients were assigned, the laundry and the sewing and the cooking and the cleaning, was work that bore a strong resemblance to the work that these women had performed in their domestic lives before admission, and the relationship between work as therapy and work as the simple reproduction of gendered domestic labor was one that the medical officers of the period did not always interrogate with the degree of critical attention that a later generation would bring to it. The category of hysteria, which we touched upon earlier in our journey through this history, deserves fuller consideration here, for it was a diagnosis of extraordinary cultural significance in the Victorian period, a diagnosis that functioned not merely as a medical label, but as a social and moral category, a means of making sense of and managing female behaviour that exceeded the boundaries of what the culture permitted. The British physician Silas Weir Mitchell, whose influence extended across the Atlantic from his practice in Philadelphia to the consulting rooms of English physicians who adopted his methods, developed in the 1870s and 1880s a treatment for hysteria and nervous prostration that he called the rest cure, a regimen of enforced bed rest, social isolation, overfeeding, and the prohibition of all intellectual and creative activity, a treatment whose theoretical basis was the belief that the nervous systems of hysterical women had been depleted by excessive mental activity and required rest and nourishment to restore their proper functioning. The rest cure was applied with varying degrees of strictness and varying degrees of consequence to many women in both private and institutional settings in the later Victorian period, and its effects on those who underwent it were not uniformly beneficial, as the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman recorded in her autobiographical story, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, a story in which the narrator's confinement and enforced passivity drive her toward, rather than away from, the dissolution of mind that the treatment was supposed to prevent. The experience of confinement, whether in a private nursing home or in a public asylum, was for many Victorian women an experience of encountering of institutional authority applied to the management of their minds and their bodies, an authority that was not always exercised cruelly or with bad intent, but that was exercised with a confidence in its own correctness that left little room for the patient's own account of her experience or her own assessment of her needs. The letters that women patients wrote from Victorian asylums, in the cases where those letters were permitted to leave the institution, rather than being held back by medical officers who judged them unsuitable for sending, speak in voices that range from the despairing to the matter of fact, from the passionately aggrieved to the quietly resigned. And they constitute, for the historian who reads them, a counter-narrative to the official record of the asylum, a narrative in which the patient is not a case or a diagnosis, but a person with a history and a voice and a perspective on her own condition that deserves, and did not always receive, the dignity of being heard. It is worth noting here, with the gentle distance that historical reflection permits, that the conditions these women describe, the loneliness of the long institutional evenings, the sameness of the days, the difficulty of maintaining connections with the family, and the life they had left behind, were conditions that were not the product of malice, but of the structural features of an institutional system that had been built on assumptions about the nature of mental illness and the requirements of its treatment that were, in many respects, deeply and consequentially mistaken. The treatment of patients whose conditions were classified as acute rather than chronic, those who had entered the asylum in the grip of a recent and severe episode of mental disturbance, and who were believed to have some reasonable prospect of recovery, differed in theory, if not always in practice, from the management of the long-term residents, who made up the growing majority of the Victorian asylum population. The acute patient was the subject of particular medical attention in the early weeks of their admission, was examined by the medical officer, had their physical condition assessed, was asked a series of questions about the history and nature of their symptoms, had their responses and their demeanour recorded in the casebook that the asylum maintained for each patient as a running record of their medical progress. The casebooks of the Victorian Asylum, which survive in considerable numbers in county archives and in the collections of the institutions, themselves are extraordinary documents, dense with the handwritten observations of the medical officers who compiled them, containing physical descriptions of patients, records of their statements and their behaviours, assessments of their mental state, and occasional longer passages of reflection, in which the physician attempted to make sense of what he was observing in terms of the theoretical frameworks available to him. Reading these casebooks today, with all the distance and the different assumptions that a century and a half of medical progress and cultural change have brought, one is struck by the simultaneity of the recognition and the incomprehension they contain, the moments in which the physician clearly sees and accurately describes something important about the patient's experience, and the moments in which the framework available to him distorts his perception in ways that are now apparent, and that were not apparent then. The physical treatments applied to acute patients in the Victorian Asylum included, alongside the hydrotherapy and the pharmacological sedation we have already noted. The use of Turkish baths and wet sheet packs, of electric stimulation, applied to various parts of the body in the hope of influencing the functioning of the nervous system, of ergot and digitalis and other plant-derived preparations whose mechanisms of action were imperfectly understood, but whose effects on various physiological processes had been empirically observed. The wet sheet pack, in which the patient was wrapped in sheets that had been soaked in cold water and then covered in dry blankets, was applied particularly to acutely disturbed patients in the hope that the initial shock of the cold, followed by the warmth generated by the body, would produce a calming effect on the nervous system. And medical officers who used this treatment reported in their casebooks results that they described as sometimes encouraging, though the criteria by which they judged encouragement and the standards against which they measured improvement were themselves so imprecisely defined that the assessment is difficult to evaluate. The dietary management of patients was considered a matter of some medical importance in the Victorian Asylum. The superintendent at Bethlem Royal Hospital, noting in his annual report of 1868 that the diet of patients required careful attention, not only as a matter of physical nourishment, but as a therapeutic instrument. The provision of appetizing and varied food being understood to contribute to the patient's sense of being valued and cared for, to the maintenance of those connections with the pleasures of ordinary life that moral treatment held to be essential to the process of recovery. The asylum farm, which most of the larger Victorian institutions maintained on the grounds surrounding the main building, produced a portion of the food consumed by the patients and staff, providing fresh vegetables and dairy products, and in some institutions meat. And the work of the farm, performed largely by male patients under the supervision of the asylum's farm staff, was understood simultaneously as a source of food, as a contribution to the economic self-sufficiency of the institution, and as a form of occupational therapy whose benefits to the patients engaged in it were believed to be genuine and measurable. And amid all the activity of treatment and management and record keeping and farm work and laundry and cooking and prayer, amid the entire complex machinery of the Victorian Asylum in its daily operation, there moved the patients themselves, individuals whose inner lives the institution could only partially apprehend, and whose suffering and resilience and occasional recovery constituted the only justification that the entire system could ultimately offer for its own existence. The figure of the asylum superintendent deserves our attention at this point in our journey, for he was the pivot around which the entire Victorian asylum turned, the individual whose character and whose competence and whose particular understanding of his responsibilities had more influence on the daily life of the institution than any legislation or any commission or any theoretical framework. And the history of the Victorian Asylum is in significant part a history of the individuals who occupied this role, of their ambitions and their limitations, and the ways in which their personalities shaped the institutions over which they presided. The medical superintendent was, by the standards of his profession, a person of considerable power and considerable isolation, responsible to the visiting committee of magistrates or county councillors who formally governed the institution, but in practice exercising a degree of day-to-day authority within the asylum walls that had no close parallel in other areas of Victorian medicine. He was responsible for the physical management of the building and its grounds, for the employment and supervision of the entire staff, for the medical treatment of every patient, for the maintenance of the registers and records that the Lunacy Commission required, for the preparation of the annual reports that the commissioners reviewed, and for the general atmosphere and culture of the institution, for the degree to which the principles of humane care were embedded in its daily practices, or were allowed to erode under the pressures of overcrowding and routine. The training that prepared Victorian physicians for this role was, for much of the century, informal and largely self-directed, a combination of experience gained as an assistant medical officer in an established asylum and the independent study of the medical literature of the specialty, supplemented from 1885 onward by the Certificate in Psychological Medicine, that the Medico-Psychological Association began to offer in that year, a qualification that provided some standardization of professional preparation, but that many superintendents of the period had made their careers without. John Charles Bucknell, who served as superintendent of the Devon County Asylum from 1844 to 1862 before pursuing a career as a writer and medical journalist, was among the most intellectually distinguished of the Victorian asylum superintendents, a figure who combined genuine clinical engagement with broad cultural interests, and who wrote, among other works, The Psychology of Shakespeare, published in 1859, a study of the representations of mental illness in the plays of Shakespeare that reflected the Victorian alienist's habit of finding in literature a mirror for the clinical phenomena he encountered in his daily practice. William Charles Hood, who served as superintendent of Bethlem Royal Hospital from 1852 to 1862, was another figure of significance, a man who undertook during his decade at Bethlem a program of reform that transformed the institution's physical conditions and its treatment practices, abolishing mechanical restraints, improving the diet and the clothing of the patients, opening a museum and a library, organizing theatrical performances and concerts, and generally pursuing what he described as the humanization of an institution whose reputation had been, for most of its long history, rather the reverse of humane. The tensions that superintendents experienced between their therapeutic ambitions and the practical constraints of institutional life were not always resolved in favor of the ambitions, and the careers of Victorian asylum superintendents are marked, in a number of cases, by a trajectory from early idealism to later accommodation, from the reforming energy of a new appointment to the managerial pragmatism of long tenure, a trajectory that the historian of the institution can trace in the changing tone and content of the annual reports that the superintendent produced year after year, the reports of the early years full of plans and proposals and expressions of therapeutic optimism, the reports of the later years more measured, more focused on the management of the existing rather than the transformation of it. And yet, there were also superintendents who maintained their reforming energy and their therapeutic conviction throughout long careers, men and women whose commitment to the humanity of their patients was a constant in their professional lives, rather than an early phase to be grown out of, and whose institutions were, by the evidence of those who lived and worked in them, genuinely different in character and in the experiences they offered from the institutions managed by those whose enthusiasms had been worn away. The attendants and nurses who provided the daily hands-on care of the Victorian asylum patient have received less attention from historians than the medical officers who supervised them, but their role was in many practical respects more immediately significant for the day-to-day experience of the patient, for it was the attendant rather than the superintendent who was present in the ward through the long hours of the day and the night, who made the small decisions about how a patient was treated in the intimate moments of daily life, who determined by the quality of their attention and the character of their manner whether the patient experienced the institution as a place of bare confinement or as a place where something recognizable as care was being attempted. The attendants of the Victorian Asylum were recruited from the working class, men and women who came to the work for wages and accommodation rather than from any professional calling, and who received, for most of the century, only the most minimal preparation for the responsibilities they were asked to assume. The standard of asylum attendant in the middle decades of the Victorian period was a matter of considerable concern to the reformers and medical officers who wrote about asylum management, who recognized that the humanity and the effectiveness of the institution depended to a very large degree on the quality of the individuals who were in direct daily contact with the patients, and who repeatedly called for better recruitment, better training, and better pay as the means of improving that quality. The Handbook for the Instruction of Attendants on the Insane, first published in 1885 by the Medico-Psychological Association, was an attempt to provide some standardized training for asylum workers, covering the physical care of patients, the management of disturbed behavior, the basic principles of nursing practice, and the general conduct expected of an asylum attendant, and it represented a recognition by the professional leadership of the specialty that the quality of lay care was inseparable from the quality of medical treatment. The relationship between attendant and patient in the Victorian Asylum was governed by rules that prohibited the attendant from striking or abusing a patient, rules that were stated clearly in the regulations of every institution and enforced with varying degrees of consistency depending on the character of the superintendent and the culture of the particular institution. Cases of attendant abuse were recorded in the minutes of visiting committees and in the proceedings of the Lunacy Commission when they came to light, and they came to light with a regularity that suggests that the gap between the stated rules and the actual practice was not trivial, though it would be equally mistaken to conclude from these cases. That abuse was the dominant experience of the typical patient, for the majority of attendants appear, from the available evidence, to have been neither saints nor brutes, but ordinarily imperfect human beings doing a difficult job in difficult conditions with inadequate preparation and insufficient support. The voices of attendants themselves, like the voices of patients, are largely absent from the formal record of the Victorian Asylum, recoverable only through the occasional memoir or published letter, through the testimony given to official inquiries, through the records of disciplinary proceedings, in which their conduct was assessed against the standards the institution claimed to hold. What those voices reveal, when they can be recovered, is a picture of institutional life, seen from a different angle than that provided by the medical officers. A picture in which the weight of the work, the physical demands of caring for a large number of disturbed, and sometimes physically ill people through long shifts with minimal rest, is the dominant feature, and in which the therapeutic ideals of the asylum's founders appear from the perspective of the ward floor as abstractions rather distant from the practical necessities of getting through the day. And it is in this gap, the gap between the therapeutic ideal articulated in the reports and the journals and the architectural plans and the daily reality experienced by the patients in their beds and the attendants on their feet and the superintendents at their desks, that the history of the Victorian Asylum is most honestly to be found in the space between what was intended and what actually happened, between what was promised and what was delivered, between the idea of the asylum and the lived experience of the place. The last decades of the Victorian period brought with them a new set of pressures and a new set of critical voices that began to question not merely the conditions of the asylum, but its fundamental premises. Not merely whether the asylum was being run well, but whether the asylum as an institution was capable, in principle, of achieving the therapeutic goals that had justified its creation and its expansion. The campaign for the reform of the lunacy laws, which gathered momentum in the 1880s and reached its legislative conclusion in the Lunacy Act of 1890, was driven in part by genuine concerns about the safeguards protecting individuals from wrongful confinement, concerns that had been given particular force by a series of published accounts from individuals who claimed to have been wrongfully confined in asylums against their will, accounts whose specific factual claims were contested by the medical profession, but whose cumulative cultural impact was considerable. The most celebrated of these accounts was Rosina Bulwer-Lytton's account of her confinement in Inverness Lodge Private Asylum in 1858, a confinement orchestrated by her estranged husband, the novelist and politician Edward Bulwer-Lytton, which she described in her book, A Blighted Life, published in 1880, a book that was read widely, and that reinforced the fear present in Victorian culture throughout the period that the certification process was insufficiently robust to prevent the asylum from being used as an instrument of private oppression. The Lunacy Act of 1890 responded to these concerns by creating more elaborate procedural safeguards around the certification process, requiring that every admission to a lunatic asylum be preceded by a judicial order as well as medical certificates, a requirement that the medical profession largely opposed on the grounds that it would deter families and physicians from seeking institutional care until conditions had deteriorated to an acute and dangerous degree. The argument of the medical profession was not without force, and the Lunacy Act of 1890 is regarded by historians of Victorian psychiatry as a document that prioritized the legal protection of the individual over the therapeutic interests of the patient, that reflected above all the anxieties of a society that had come to regard the asylum with a mixture of social necessity and profound unease. The unease that Victorian society felt about its asylums was not simply a response to sensational accounts of abuse or wrongful confinement, but reflected something deeper, a cultural anxiety about the boundary between sanity and madness, about the possibility that the line separating the confined patient from the free citizen was less stable and less certain than the ordered surface of Victorian social life suggested. The Victorian novel, which functioned among other things as a cultural mirror in which the anxieties of the society were reflected and worked upon, returned repeatedly to the asylum as a setting and to madness as a theme. From The Confined Misses, Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre of 1847, hidden in the attic of Thornfield Hall in a confinement whose circumstances raised questions about the relationship between female passion and institutional control, that the novel left productively unresolved to the various mad and quasi-mad figures who populated the sensation fiction of the 1860s and the Gothic narratives of the later Victorian period. Wilkie Collins, whose novel The Woman in White had appeared in 1859 and whose plot turned on the wrongful confinement of a sane woman in a private asylum, had given cultural form to an anxiety that was not purely fictional, and the legal and institutional history of the period suggests that the scenario he imagined, however sensationally presented, was not entirely without real-world foundation. It is worth reflecting, from the distance of the present, on what this cultural anxiety tells us about Victorian society's relationship with the asylum it had built. For the fear of wrongful confinement, the fear that one might be declared mad and locked away, was, in some sense, the dark underside of the trust that the asylum system required in order to function. The shadow cast by the power that had been given to physicians and magistrates and family members to remove individuals from ordinary social life and place them behind institutional walls. And this anxiety, this unease that ran through Victorian culture like a quiet current, beneath the surface of official confidence and institutional pride, was perhaps itself a sign of something important. A sign that the society which had built these great institutions knew, at some level that it was not always willing to articulate, that the power it had created was a power that required, above all, the kind of careful and humble oversight that the systems of the period were only imperfectly equipped to provide. The physical ailments that accompanied mental illness in the Victorian asylum formed a significant part of the medical burden that the institution was called upon to carry, for the population of the Victorian asylum was not only mentally unwell, but was also, by reason of the conditions of poverty and deprivation from which many of its patients had come, frequently physically compromised in ways that complicated and deepened the task of care. Tuberculosis, which was the single most significant infectious disease in Victorian England, and the leading cause of death in the country throughout much of the century, was a condition of particular concern in the closed institutional environment of the asylum, where the close quarters and the limited ventilation of overcrowded wards created conditions conducive to the transmission of the tubercle bacillus that Robert Koch had identified in 1882, a discovery whose implications for the understanding and eventual control of the disease were profound, but whose practical benefits were many decades away from being realized in the daily life of the Victorian asylum. The annual reports of asylum superintendents from the later Victorian period record tuberculosis as a major cause of patient mortality, with a regularity and a matter-of-factness that reflects both the ubiquity of the disease in the period and the limited means available for its prevention or treatment. The reports noting the number of patients who had died of phthisis or consumption during the year, and expressing the hope that the improvements in ventilation and in the condition of the wards that the superintendent had been requesting would, when they were finally provided, contribute to a reduction in the mortality that he was recording. The relationship between mental illness and physical health was understood by Victorian physicians in terms that recognized the connection, without always being able to explain it. The asylum medical officer, observing that his patients were, on average, physically less robust than the general population, more susceptible to infectious disease, more likely to suffer from the complications of conditions that the poverty of their origins had left untreated, more likely to die at younger ages than those who had not been confined. General paralysis of the insane, which we have noted earlier in this account, was the condition that most clearly demonstrated the intersection of physical and mental illness in the Victorian asylum, a progressive neurological disorder whose course the asylum physicians of the period had described with considerable clinical Precision despite having no means of identifying its underlying cause, as infection with the bacterium Treponema pallidum, the causative organism of syphilis, a connection that would not be definitively established until 1913 when Hideo Noguchi and J.W. Moore demonstrated the presence of the syphilis spirochete in the brain tissue of patients who had died of general paralysis. The Victorian asylum physician, watching the progressive deterioration of a patient with general paralysis, the gradual dissolution of personality and judgment and memory, and finally of the basic functions of life, watching this deterioration without any means of halting it, or any understanding of its cause, was in a position that combined genuine clinical compassion with genuine medical helplessness, a position that recurred, with variations, across many of the conditions that filled the wards of the Victorian Asylum. The management of epilepsy in the Victorian Asylum was another area in which the gap between observation and understanding was particularly wide, the medical officers noting with care the frequency and character of their patients' seizures, experimenting with the bromide salts that had come into use as anticonvulsants from the 1850s onward, and that provided a degree of symptomatic relief, but having no access to the deeper understanding of epilepsy as a disorder of neuronal function that would eventually make possible the more specific and more effective treatments of a later era. The diet, the exercise, the occupational routine, the warmth and ventilation of the wards, all of these environmental factors were understood by the more thoughtful Victorian asylum physicians to have a bearing on the physical health of their patients, and the effort to improve these conditions was a recurring theme in the annual reports and the professional correspondence of the period, an effort that met with partial and uneven success in the face of the funding constraints and the administrative priorities that governed the practical reality of institutional life. And through all of this, through the physical illness and the overcrowding and the limited treatments and the uncertain prognoses, the patients of the Victorian Asylum continued to live their days, to perform their work and attend their chapel and walk in their gardens, to maintain such connections with the world outside the walls as the institution permitted, to carry within themselves the private landscapes of their suffering and their endurance that the case books and the annual reports could only approximately map. The architecture of the Victorian Asylum was not merely a practical arrangement of spaces for the housing and management of a large institutional population, but was, in the minds of those who designed it, an active participant in the therapeutic process, an embodiment in stone and brick and glass of the principles of moral treatment, and the evolution of asylum architecture across the Victorian period traces in its own way the changing ideas and changing ambitions of the institution. The corridor plan, which dominated English asylum architecture from the 1820s onward, arranged the patients' wards as a series of long corridors radiating from a central administrative block, a plan that facilitated the supervision of patients by staff, that created clear separations between different classes of patient, and that could be extended relatively easily as the patient population grew, qualities that recommended it on grounds of practicality and economy, as much as on grounds of therapeutic theory. The corridor asylum, built in this plan, presented to the outside world a facade of imposing civic dignity, its clock tower or its Italianate campanile, or its Gothic entrance gateway, signalling its status as a major public institution, a monument to the Victorian belief in institutional solutions to social problems, while within the facade the long corridors extended in both directions. their high ceilings and their rows of windows, providing the light and air that the architects and the medical theorists agreed was essential to the patient's well-being. The airing court, an enclosed outdoor space attached to each ward, and allowing the patients access to fresh air and outdoor movement without the expense and the supervision required for walks in the open countryside, was a standard feature of the Victorian Asylum plan, and the provision of adequate airing courts was a matter to which the Lunacy Commission's inspectors paid particular attention, noting in their reports when courts were too small or too bare, or insufficiently sheltered for use in cold weather, and pressing the institutions they inspected to improve them. The farm and the gardens that surrounded the main building of the Victorian County Asylum served multiple purposes simultaneously, providing food, providing occupational therapy for the male patients who worked in them, providing the visual experience of cultivated green space that the architectural theorists of the asylum believed to be beneficial to the minds of those who could see it from the asylum windows, and providing a buffer zone of institutional ownership between the asylum and the surrounding community that maintained the separateness and the self-sufficiency on which the institution prided itself. The design of the amusement hall or recreation room, the space in which the asylum concerts and dances and theatrical performances took place, was given particular attention in the asylum planning of the mid-Victorian period, reflecting the importance that moral treatment placed on the provision of rational recreation as a means of engaging the mind and of maintaining the patient's sense of participation in something resembling the social life of the world outside. Thomas Story Kirkbride, an American asylum superintendent, whose 1854 book on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane became an influential guide to asylum design on both sides of the Atlantic, argued that the building itself was a curative instrument of the first importance, that every feature of its design, from the arrangement of the wards to the character of the gardens, from the height of the ceilings to the provision of airing courts, contributed either to the patient's recovery or to its prevention, and that the asylum superintendent, who was serious about treating his patients, effectively must be equally serious about the physical environment in which that treatment took place. The tension between the therapeutic ideal articulated by Kirkbride and his contemporaries, and the practical reality of an institution stretched beyond its designed capacity, was perhaps most visible in the physical fabric of the asylum itself, in the additional wards hastily constructed to accommodate the growing population, in the airing courts divided to serve twice the number they had been designed for, in the recreation hall converted to a dormitory, as the need for sleeping space overrode the need for leisure space, in all the visible signs of a system that had expanded faster than its resources, and that was, in its physical form as in its therapeutic culture, showing the strain. The question of recovery, of what it meant to be cured of mental illness and return to the world outside the asylum, was one that occupied the Victorian asylum physician with insistence that reflects both the genuine therapeutic commitment of the more conscientious practitioners and the institutional anxiety that surrounded the discharge of patients whose subsequent well-being reflected on the reputation of the institution and the competence of its medical staff. The discharge rates of Victorian asylums, which are recorded in the annual reports and which were compiled in aggregate by the Lunacy Commission in its own annual publications, show a pattern that is consistent with the picture of increasing chronicity that we have already noted. The proportion of admitted patients who were eventually discharged, recovered, declining across the decades of the Victorian period as the asylum population aged and as the proportion of long-term residents grew. The criteria for discharge in the Victorian asylum were not defined by any consistent or systematic standard, but were left to the judgment of the medical superintendent, who was expected to assess whether the patient's mental state had improved sufficiently to allow safe return to the community, whether the family or other support network existed to receive and support the discharged patient, and whether the circumstances that had precipitated the admission had changed sufficiently to make a relapse unlikely. The family's role in the process of discharge was significant. For the superintendent who wished to discharge a patient, needed to be able to identify a responsible person in the community willing to receive and care for them, a requirement that in practice meant that patients whose families were unable or unwilling to take them back had a much reduced chance of discharge, regardless of the state of their mental health. The experience of discharge, for those who underwent it, was a transition that the Victorian asylum did relatively little to prepare its patients for. The institutional culture of the asylum, having oriented itself towards the management of the confined, rather than the preparation of the returnable, toward the maintenance of the patient in the institutional setting, rather than the cultivation of the capacities that would allow them to function outside it. Patients who were discharged, recovered from Victorian asylums, entered a world that had continued without them, a world in which their position in family and community and employment had often been filled by another, in which the stigma of having been confined in an asylum, the social mark that the Victorian period attached to mental illness and institutional treatment, complicated their attempts to resume the ordinary relationships and the ordinary occupations of life. The concept of the trial discharge, in which the patient was released to the supervision of a relative or other responsible person for a defined period before being formally struck from the asylum's register, was an attempt to manage the risks associated with discharge, to create a transitional arrangement that allowed the patient to be monitored and to be returned to the asylum if necessary, without the formal machinery of a new certification, and it was widely practiced in Victorian asylums as a pragmatic response to the difficulty of the discharge decision. And in the lives of those who navigated this transition successfully, who left the asylum and rebuilt their lives in the world outside, who raised children and maintained households, and returned to employment and formed friendships and lived and died in the ordinary way of human beings in those lives, which are largely invisible to the historian, because they did not generate the kinds of records that archival research can recover, lies the most important part of the Victorian asylum story. The part that neither the pessimism of Maudsley nor the optimism of the retreat's founders fully captures. The quiet and imperfectly documented story of human beings enduring an imperfect institution, and, in some number of cases, finding within or beyond it some degree of the peace and the order that the institution had promised and had, in its complicated and contradicted way, sometimes actually managed to provide. The closing years of the Victorian era, those quiet years at the end of a long century, that had seen more change in the organization of human society than perhaps any comparable period before it, brought to the asylum system a set of new intellectual currents that were beginning, slowly, and with the caution that institutional systems always apply to ideas that challenge their foundational assumptions, to reshape the way in which the medical profession thought about the mind and its disorders. The work being done in Vienna by Sigmund Freud, whose early publications on hysteria appeared in collaboration with Joseph Breuer in 1895, in their studies on hysteria, and whose broader theoretical framework of psychoanalysis was taking shape in those same years, at the end of the century, represented a challenge to the purely somatic understanding of mental illness that had dominated Victorian psychiatric thinking, a challenge that said, in essence, that the mind had its own history, its own logic, its own structures of meaning and of conflict, and that understanding these structures was as important to the treatment of mental illness as any examination of brain tissue or any measurement of reflex responses. The implications of this challenge for the asylum as an institution were not immediately apparent in the 1890s, and indeed the influence of psychoanalytic thinking on the practice of the large public asylum would be slow in coming and would never be complete, for the asylum as a system was oriented toward the management of a large and largely chronic population by means that were practical rather than exploratory, that required efficiency of administration rather than the hours of individual conversation that the new talking therapies demanded. But the fact that these ideas were circulating, that the question of what happened in the interior of the individual mind was being asked with new seriousness and new theoretical ambition, was itself a sign of the larger shift in the intellectual climate that was occurring at the end of the Victorian period, a shift in which the confidence of the earlier decades in the straightforward applicability of physical science to the problem of mental illness was giving way to a more complex and more humble understanding of the territory that was being explored. Jean-Martin Charcot, the great French neurologist who had built at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, the most famous clinic for the study of nervous diseases in Europe, had, through his elaborate theatrical demonstrations of hypnosis and hysteria in the 1880s, brought the question of the relationship between the mind and the body to the attention of an audience far wider than the specialist medical readership. Demonstrations that were attended by visitors from across Europe, including the young Freud himself, who spent several months in Paris in 1885 and 1886 studying under Charcot, and returned to Vienna with the conviction that the mental life of the patient was a subject of the same scientific seriousness as the anatomy of the nervous system. The word neurasthenia, coined by the American neurologist George Beard in 1869 to describe a condition of nervous exhaustion characterized by fatigue, anxiety, and a range of physical symptoms without apparent organic cause, had by the 1890s become one of the most commonly applied diagnoses in the medical practice of the period, a diagnosis that bridged the territory between the somatic and the psychological, that acknowledged the reality of suffering without reducing it entirely to either brain disease or moral failing, and that reflected the growing sense among the medical profession that the spectrum of mental disturbance extended far beyond the severe and the acute conditions that filled the wards of the public asylum into the milder and more pervasive territory of nervous illness that touched the lives of a much wider proportion of the population. The private nerve clinic, which was distinct from the public lunatic asylum, and which catered to the wealthier patients who sought treatment for these milder nervous conditions without the stigma and the legal machinery of certification, was a feature of the later Victorian medical landscape that reflected this expanding understanding of mental illness, and that pointed, in its way, toward the outpatient and community-based models of psychiatric care that the 20th century would eventually develop. And in the public asylum itself, in the overcrowded wards and the institutional routines and the annual reports that recorded the slow accumulation of chronic patients and the modest discharge of the recovered, the century was drawing toward its close, with a system that had grown enormously, that had provided to many thousands of individuals a degree of shelter and care that they would not otherwise have had. And that had also, in its imperfections and its failures, accumulated a weight of institutional experience that the next century would be obliged to reckon with honestly and at length. Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January in the year 1901 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight after a reign of 63 years and 7 months. And her death marked not only the passing of a monarch, but the end of a particular chapter in the cultural and institutional history of England. The end of the era that had given the asylum its greatest expansion and its most complex and contradicted character. The new century that opened in the wake of her death was one in which the forces that had been building throughout the later Victorian period, the doubts about hereditarian pessimism, the new psychological theories emerging from Vienna and Paris and Edinburgh, the growing concern about the conditions of the large institutional asylum, and the nascent movements for the rights and the dignity of the mentally ill, would gather and combine into something new, into a set of challenges and reforms that would eventually, over the course of the 20th century, transform the psychiatric landscape beyond recognition. But in the early years of the new century, the Victorian asylum system continued to operate much as it had in the final decades of the reign, the great buildings standing as they had always stood in their grounds, their clocks marking the institutional hours, their workshops busy, and their wards full, their attendants doing the difficult daily work of care, under conditions that had changed less than the death of the old queen might have suggested. The Edwardian period, those brief years of relative prosperity and cultural self-confidence that separated the Victorian era from the catastrophe of the First World War, produced in the realm of psychiatric care a number of significant developments that built upon the ambivalent legacy of the Victorian asylum and pushed in new directions, including the establishment of the first outpatient departments for the treatment of mental illness and the growing interest in the milder forms of nervous disorder that could be treated without confinement. The Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, passed 12 years after the end of the Victorian era, but deeply rooted in its intellectual inheritance, reflected the continuing influence of the hereditarian ideas that had shaped so much of late Victorian psychiatric thinking, creating a system of legal classification and institutional provision for those identified as mentally defective that drew on the same assumptions about inheritance and degeneration that Henry Maudsley had articulated in the 1870s, and that the eugenics movement had, in the opening years of the new century, given a new and darker urgency. The First World War, which began in August 1914, and which subjected millions of men to conditions of physical danger and psychological stress that no previous generation had been required to endure on such a scale, produced in its aftermath a generation of patients whose suffering, classified under the name of shell shock and related terms, would force the medical profession to take the psychological dimensions of illness more seriously than the somatic tradition of Victorian psychiatry had always been willing to do. The treatment of shell shock, conducted in military hospitals and convalescent settings, rather than in the public asylum, became an important site for the development of the new psychological therapies for the demonstration that talking and listening and the careful exploration of the patient's inner experience could produce genuine therapeutic benefit even in conditions of severe psychological disturbance. A demonstration that would have lasting consequences for the direction of psychiatric practice in the decades that followed. And through all of this transformation, through all the intellectual upheavals and the institutional reforms, and the catastrophic disruptions of war, and of the social changes that war accelerated, the great Victorian asylum buildings continued to stand, continued to house their patients, continued to employ their attendants, continued to mark their institutional hours with the same clocks that had been installed in the confident years of the century before, waiting in their patient institutional way for the transformation that was coming, slowly but with a certainty that the history of ideas always eventually produces, the transformation that would eventually empty their wards and close their gates and leave their long facades to the purposes that the 21st century would find for them. The legacy of the Victorian asylum, as it can be assessed from the distance of more than a century, is a legacy of genuine complexity, of intentions and outcomes that do not resolve into simple judgment, of a system that contained within it both the best impulses of Victorian benevolence and the deepest contradictions of Victorian social organization, and that must be understood in all its complexity, if it is to be understood honestly. The reformers who created the asylum system, the Tukes and the Connollys and the Shaftesburys, were motivated by a genuine and often deeply felt concern for the welfare of those who suffered from mental illness, a concern that expressed itself in real effort and real achievement, in the abolition of chains and the provision of gardens and the insistence that the patients of the asylum were human beings deserving of dignity and of care. The system they created, however, was one whose internal logic pulled against its therapeutic ambitions in ways that they did not always foresee and could not always control. A system in which the combination of compulsory admission, indefinite confinement, institutional self-sufficiency, and the progressive accumulation of a chronic long-term population created conditions that tended, over time, toward the institutionalization of the patient and the bureaucratization of the care, toward the replacement of the therapeutic ideal with the managerial routine, toward the slow erosion of the humanity that the reformers had worked to establish, the voices that challenged the asylum. From within the Victorian period itself, the voices of John Connolly arguing for non-restraint, and Daniel Hack Tuke arguing for therapeutic optimism, and the patients themselves writing their letters from behind the asylum walls. These voices are part of the legacy too, evidence that the contradictions of the system were visible to those who inhabited it, and that the critique of the institution was not something imposed retrospectively by a later generation, but was present, however imperfectly heard, within the Victorian period itself. The social and cultural legacy of the Victorian asylum is perhaps most visible in the word Bedlam itself, in the way the name of the oldest English institution for the care of the mentally ill became a common noun meaning chaos and disorder, and unmanageable noise, a linguistic trace of the long historical association between mental illness and the disruption of social order that the Victorians' asylum system both inherited and perpetuated, an association that the reforms of the period attempted to challenge but never fully succeeded in dissolving. The architecture of the Victorian asylum has left its physical mark on the English landscape in the form of the great buildings that remain, many of them now converted to residential use, their long facades, and their clock towers, and their chapel spires visible in the landscape of towns and suburbs as monuments to a particular moment in the history of institutional care, buildings that carry within their walls a history that the planners of new apartment developments do not always choose to foreground, and that the residents who live within them may or may not be aware of as, as they move through the corridors where other, very different lives were once lived. The patients who passed through those corridors, who slept in the wards and worked in the workshops and walked in the airing courts and attended the chapel services and wrote their letters home, are for the most part invisible to history in the way that institutional populations are always invisible, their names recorded in admission registers and case books and discharge records, but their lives and their inner experiences largely beyond the reach of the historical archive. And yet they were there, they were present in those buildings and in that history in the most complete and irreducible way that a human being can be present anywhere. And the history of the Victorian Asylum is, before it is anything else, their history, the history of the several 100,000 individuals who were identified as mad in Victorian England and Wales, and who found themselves, as a consequence of that identification, in the care of an institution that was simultaneously one of the most ambitious and one of the most troubled experiments in the management of human suffering that the modern world has produced. The science of the mind that the Victorian period bequeathed to the 20th century was a science in transition, a science that had established its institutional foundations in the asylum, and its professional identity in the alienist and the medico-psychological association. But that was in the closing years of the century, beginning to recognize that its theoretical frameworks were inadequate to the phenomena they were supposed to explain, and that its therapeutic methods were insufficient to the suffering they were supposed to relieve. The contribution of the Victorian Asylum to the development of psychiatric knowledge was real, even if it was achieved at a cost in human suffering that the knowledge does not always seem to justify, for it was in the wards of the asylum that the clinical descriptions of the major mental illnesses were developed and refined, the careful observations of thousands of patients over decades of institutional practice, providing the raw material from which the diagnostic categories of modern psychiatry were eventually constructed. The work of Emil Kraepelin, the German psychiatrist whose Compendium der Psychiatrie first appeared in 1883, and whose successive editions, culminating in the great 8th edition of 1909 to 1913, established the classification of mental diseases into the two great categories of dementia, praecox and manic depressive insanity, that would form the framework of 20th century psychiatric diagnosis, was built on the clinical observations accumulated in the asylum system, on the longitudinal study of patients followed over the years of the institutional careers, in a way that only the asylum made possible. The concept of dementia praecox, which Kraepelin used to describe the group of conditions characterized by a progressive deterioration of mental function beginning in early life, and which Eugen Bleuler would in 1911 rename schizophrenia, was constructed from the clinical observations of patients in institutions. Much like the Victorian asylums we have been describing, observations of the course and the outcome of illness over years and decades that no other setting of the period could have provided. The identification of the organic basis of general paralysis of the insane. The demonstration by Hideo Noguchi and J.W. Moore in 1913 that the brains of patients who had died of this condition contained the syphilis spirochaete, and the subsequent development of treatments that could halt or reverse the neurological damage, represented the most dramatic therapeutic advance in the early 20th century psychiatry of the asylum, a demonstration that the somatic approach to mental illness could, when the biology was actually understood, produce the kind of specific and effective treatment that the Victorian optimists had always believed was in principle possible. The development of effective treatments for neurosyphilis. First, the use of malaria therapy, introduced by Julius Wagner Jauregg in 1917, for which he received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1927. And later the use of penicillin transformed the population of the psychiatric hospital by eliminating a condition that had accounted for a substantial proportion of admissions, a transformation that offered a model of what was possible when the biological basis of a psychiatric condition was properly understood. And in this gradual accumulation of genuine knowledge, this slow building of understanding upon the foundation of clinical observation and biological investigation that the Victorian Asylum had in its inadequate and often troubling way made possible, there is something that the historian can acknowledge alongside the catalogue of suffering and failure, a recognition that the Victorian psychiatrists, for all their limitations and all their errors, were engaged in a genuine intellectual project, were attempting with the tools available to them to understand and to relieve one of the most profound forms of human suffering, and that their attempts, however imperfect, contributed in real ways to the knowledge that later generations would use more effectively and more humanely. The movement toward deinstitutionalization, toward the replacement of the large asylum with smaller community-based services, had its intellectual origins in the critiques that had been building since the later Victorian period, and its practical beginnings in the middle decades of the 20th century. And its history represents the final chapter in the story of the asylum as the dominant institution of psychiatric care. The publication in 1961 of Irving Goffman's Asylums, a sociological study of what Goffman called total institutions, those institutions that governed every aspect of their inmates' daily lives, provided one of the most influential theoretical critiques of the asylum as an institution, arguing that the asylum did not merely contain madness, but produced it. That the institutional regime itself created a set of behaviors and a deterioration of the self that was mistaken for the natural course of mental illness, but was in fact the product of the institutional environment. Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, published in French in 1961 and translated into English in 1965, offered a different but equally influential critique, a historical argument that the confinement of the mad was not a medical response to a biological condition, but a social and political act, a means by which Enlightenment rationality had defined and excluded its own other, its own limit, and that the asylum was therefore a political institution as much as a medical one. These theoretical critiques found practical expression in the policies of deinstitutionalization that were pursued in England and Wales from the 1950s onward, policies facilitated by the introduction of the first effective antipsychotic medications, beginning with chlorpromazine in 1952, which for the first time provided a pharmacological means of managing the most disturbing symptoms of psychosis outside the institutional setting, and which transformed the practical possibilities of community-based care. The Mental Health Act of 1959 in England and Wales represented a decisive legislative step away from the Victorian model of compulsory institutional care, replacing the certification machinery of the 1890 Lunacy Act. with a framework that emphasized voluntary treatment and informal admission that treated mental illness as far as possible like physical illness, and that expressed a new policy commitment to the reduction of the institutional population and the development of community services. The great Victorian asylums began to empty in the decades following the 1959 Act, their population declining gradually at first, and then with increasing speed as the policy of deinstitutionalization accelerated in the 1970s and 198. Zoos, their wards closing one by one, their staff dispersing to the new community settings that were being established, their buildings falling quiet in the way that large institutional buildings do when the life that animated them withdraws. Colney Hatch Asylum, which had opened in 1851 as the largest asylum in England, closed as a psychiatric hospital in 1993 and was subsequently converted into residential apartments, its long Italianate facade now enclosing the private lives of its new residents in rooms that had once been wards, its clock tower still rising above the North London landscape as a reminder of the institutionals and the institutional failures of the Victorian century. And the question that the deinstitutionalization movement raised, and that remains unresolved in the 21st century, the question of what adequate community-based care for the severely mentally ill actually requires, and whether the resources committed to it have ever been sufficient to the need, is itself part of the legacy of the Victorian asylum, a question that the great building projects and the legislative reforms and the annual reports of the Lunacy Commission could not answer, because it was not yet the question being asked, and that we are still, in our own time, working imperfectly toward answering. The history of psychiatry in the 20th century, as it moved away from the Victorian asylum model and toward new therapeutic approaches and new institutional frameworks, was marked by both genuine progress and new forms of failure, both by the development of effective treatments that Victorian physicians could not have imagined, and by the creation of new problems and new injustices that the reformers of the Victorian period would have recognized in their essential character as familiar. The psychopharmacological revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, which began with chlorpromazine and expanded to include the various antidepressants and mood stabilizers and anxiolytics that transformed the pharmacological treatment of mental illness, represented a genuine advance in the ability to relieve the most severe and disabling symptoms of psychiatric conditions, an advance built upon the biological tradition of Victorian psychiatry that had insisted on the somatic basis of mental illness, even when it lacked the means to act effectively on that insistence. The psychological therapies that developed in the 20th century, from the psychoanalytic tradition rooted in Freud's Vienna, to the cognitive and behavioral therapies, whose origins lay in the experimental psychology of the mid-century, represented the fulfillment of the promise of the moral treatment tradition, the development of structured, evidence-based psychological interventions that engage the patient as an active participant in their own recovery, rather than as a passive recipient of institutional management. The Community Mental Health Centre, which became the favoured model of psychiatric care delivery in the post-asylum era, attempted to combine the accessibility of outpatient services with the ability to provide intensive support to those in acute distress, a model that worked reasonably well for many patients, but that struggled to provide adequate care for those with the most severe and enduring conditions, for whom the loss of the asylum's 24-hour residential support created a gap that the community services of the period were often unable to fill. The phenomenon of homelessness among those with severe mental illness, which became increasingly visible in the cities of England and the United States in the 1980s, was one of the more troubling consequences of deinstitutionalization in a context of insufficient community support, a reminder that the Victorian Asylum, for all its faults and all its failures, had provided shelter and sustenance to individuals who had nowhere else to go, and that the removal of that shelter without adequate replacement was itself a form of institutional failure. The recovery movement, which emerged in the 1990s and gained increasing influence in mental health policy in the early 21st century, the movement that insisted on the importance of hope and agency and social inclusion in the experience of mental illness, that asserted the right of those who experienced mental distress to define their own recovery rather than having it defined for them by professional authority, was in some ways a return to the earliest and most humane impulses of the moral treatment tradition, an insistence that the person behind the diagnosis mattered, that their own understanding of their experience deserved respect and attention and the dignity of being heard. And in tracing this long arc from the chains of Bethlem to the Community Mental Health Centre, from the certification machinery of the 1845 Lunacy Act to the recovery movement of the 21st century, what one finds is not a simple story of progress, not a straightforward narrative of enlightenment following darkness, but something more complicated and more honest. A story of repeated attempts to understand and to respond to one of the most profound challenges that human existence presents, attempts that have been marked by genuine compassion and genuine error in roughly equal measure, that have produced genuine relief and genuine harm in ways that are not always easy to separate, and that reflect, in each successive generation, the limitations as well as the ambitions of the society that undertook them. The philosophical questions that the history of the Victorian Asylum raises are not merely historical questions, not merely questions about what happened in a particular institution, in a particular country, in a particular century, but questions about the nature of the mind and the nature of society and the nature of the responsibilities that human beings have toward one another when those responsibilities are most difficult to discharge, when the person who requires care is not easy to help and not easy to understand, and not always able to articulate what it is that they need. The Victorian alienists who built the asylum system were operating within a framework of assumptions that we can now identify as limited, and in some cases as deeply mistaken, assumptions about gender and class and heredity, and the boundaries of rationality, assumptions that shaped the institution in ways that caused harm that those who built it did not always intend. And yet the question of how to care for those whose minds are most troubled, how to provide shelter and safety and treatment and human connection to those who are least able to provide these things for themselves, is not a question that the critique of the Victorian Asylum resolves, is not a question that any generation has yet answered satisfactorily, and is not a question that will be answered without the same combination of genuine compassion and genuine humility that the best of the Victorian reformers brought to it, however imperfectly they were able to act on it. The history of the asylum reminds us, gently and with some persistence, that institutions are the products of the values and the knowledge of the societies that create them, that they embody in their architecture and their practices and their legal frameworks the assumptions of their moment, and that those assumptions are always partial, always subject to revision, always revealed by the passage of time to have been less complete and less certain than they appeared to those who held them. There is in this recognition not despair, but a kind of quiet invitation, an invitation to hold the institutions of our own time with the same critical affection that we bring to the institutions of the Victorian past, to ask of them the same questions we ask of Colney Hatch and Bethlem and Broadmoor, to ask whether they embody our best understanding of what care requires, or merely our most convenient approximation of it. And in the lives of those who were cared for and confined in the Victorian asylum, in the lives of the men and women, and in some cases, the children who passed through its gates, and whose experiences form the substance of this history, there is something that resists the purely analytical treatment, something that the historian's careful reconstruction of dates and legislation and medical theories cannot quite reach, the irreducible particularity of individual suffering and individual endurance, the specific texture of a specific life lived within specific walls at a specific moment in the history of a society that was trying, in its contradicted and imperfect way, to do something genuinely difficult and genuinely important. The stone buildings are quieter now, many of them, their long corridors no longer filled with the sounds of institutional life. The clatter of the dinner trolley, and the key in the lock, and the distant piano in the recreation hall, no longer marked by the rhythms of the asylum day that governed the lives of so many for so long. Some of these buildings still stand as hospitals, transformed into modern psychiatric units whose bright open wards and voluntary admissions and multidisciplinary teams would be unrecognizable to the Victorian superintendents who once walked the corridors in their frock coats, their casebooks under their arms, their stethoscopes in their pockets, their faces carrying the particular expression of men who had committed themselves to a task whose difficulty they understood and whose resolution they could not quite see. Others have been converted to the domestic purposes of the 21st century, their high salinged rooms now containing the quiet furniture of private life, their windows looking out on the same gardens and grounds that the patients of the Victorian era walked in the afternoons, gardens whose history those who tend them now may or may not know, may or may not pause to consider as they move through the green and ordered space. The records of the Victorian Asylum, the admission registers, and the casebooks, and the annual reports, and the inspector's notes, and the patient's letters that survived the institutional transitions of the 20th century, rest in the archives of county record offices and hospital trusts and national collections, their pages yellowing slowly in the archival darkness, their handwriting legible still to those who learn to read it, their contents waiting for the historians and the genealogists and the descendants who come to find in them the traces of lives that were lived at a particular intersection of private suffering and public institution. The names in those registers, the names entered in the careful copperplate of the admission clerk, on the day that each patient arrived at the asylum gate, those names are the most durable residue of the Victorian asylum's history, the simplest and most irreducible acknowledgement that behind every case and every diagnosis and every annual statistic there was a person with a name and a history and a family and a life that existed before the asylum, and in many cases continued after it. And it is with those names, with the quiet acknowledgement of those specific and particular human lives, that the history of the Victorian asylum rests most honestly, most completely, most humbly, in the face of what it is attempting to describe, which is nothing less than the experience of being human in a world that has not yet learned, and perhaps never will entirely learn, how to respond with adequate wisdom and adequate compassion to the full range of what human minds are capable of suffering. Outside the window of wherever you are listening to this, the night is, as it always is, still and unhurried and indifferent in the most comfortable way to the passage of the centuries that have been described in this long and quiet account. The stars above, if the sky is clear, the clouds above, if it is not, the darkness in either case, the same darkness that settled over the airing courts of Colney Hatch and Bethlem, and the York Retreat on the nights of the Victorian era, the same darkness in which the patients lay in their institutional beds and breathed the institutional air, and carried within them the private experiences of their lives, experiences that the institution could only partially comprehend. You are here, and they were there, and the distance between your present and their past is absolute in one sense, and in another sense is nothing, is as thin as the page of an admission register, as brief as the tick of an institutional clock, as light as the memory of candlelight on a stone corridor wall at the end of a long Victorian day. Let the history settle around you now, as it always does, as all history does, becoming the ground beneath the present, rather than the foreground of it, becoming the quiet foundation of everything that has come after, including this moment, including this breath, including the particular quality of rest that comes when the mind has traveled far enough through the past to be grateful, simply and completely grateful, for the particular safety and the particular ordinary comfort of the present. The Victorian Asylum has returned to its documents, to its archives, to the long sleep of institutional history, and you are here, entirely here, in the only moment that is yours to inhabit, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the past release from your shoulders with the gentle certainty that it always has released, that it always does, that the past asks nothing of the present except to be remembered with honesty and with care. And so we rest, you and I, in the quiet that follows the end of a long story, in the particular stillness that comes when the last sentence has been spoken, and the silence opens around it like a room you have been waiting to enter, a room that is warm and dark and yours entirely, where nothing more is required of you than to let your breathing slow and slow again, and let the night do what the night has always done, quietly, without urgency, without drama, carrying you gently down into the deep and restoring dark of sleep.